In a few weeks, Sugar Land Baptist Church is going to present a full-scale production of Celebrate Life. Celebrate Life is a musical that has really become a monument in Baptist church music. It's a very influential work, a very impactful work that has really influenced the life of the church and influenced the music of the church in the 50 years since it's been written. This is the 50th anniversary of Celebrate Life, and to prepare us for that Sunday when we present it, we sat down and had a conversation with two experts in the field of Baptist church music, Dr. Randall Bradley and Dr. Terry York, both of which are professors at Baylor University. This conversation was very interesting and very stimulating. We were able to talk about the impact of Celebrate Life and also even what God may have for us in this year's production of it. We hope that you enjoy this conversation and perhaps you learn something as well. Let's go to Waco, Texas now with that conversation. So first of all, I just want to ask you all, what was your first interaction with Celebrate Life, either as a singer or directing it, or the first memories you had about this kind of monument in church music?
Well, my first encounter with Celebrate Life was in the summer of 1973. And my cousins who had lived in New Mexico moved back to Alabama, and they had a score of Celebrate Life, and they had been to a summer camp and had learned the musical and done it. So one of my cousins was particularly musical, so she and I sat for hours and hours and hours at the upright piano in our little mobile home in Alabama and pecked out all of these melodies. And I had never heard anything like this. The only exposure I had literally ever had at that point in my life was the Broadman hymnal, and our church used the King James Bible and whatever our preacher said. So to hear not only the music, but this text that spoke in words that people were using at the time, this language just poured over me. And, he's the wind I soar on, he's the grass I run through. Those were just images that I had never thought of. Those are kinds of language, and it connected with me as who I was as a 13-year-old boy going into the 8th grade that summer. So that was my first interaction with this, and then I played it and learned all the parts and all this kind of stuff. And later, my cousin would sing a lot of times, "I Quietly Turn to You," and I would play it for her at church. And so that was the first time, and then it moves on a little bit. Yeah.
And for me, when it first released in 1972, I was newly married, was approaching graduation in college, was serving in a little church that we didn't feel like we could do anything other than very simple music. So I learned about it in bits and pieces that I would hear being done in other churches or other sources. My first time hearing it, seeing it, singing it cover to cover, I really don't remember. I conducted it. I think I remember some important moments in conducting it or hearing it more than I remember the first time that I did either one of those. One of those times for me was way beyond 1972 when it first came out, but it was probably in 85, 86, something like that. I was at the Baptist Sunday School Board in Nashville, as you mentioned, and I was asked to go to North Carolina. The Buncombe County Baptist Association, I think it was, had got all of the youth choirs together from all over the county, and we went to the platform, the stage in Ridgecrest Conference Center, and I was the conductor it was like a 3-day thing, and we did Celebrate Life from cover to cover. That was quite moving experience to help those young people see it for the first time. And to hear at that point, that's the early 80s, so it's 10 or more years old, the work was to hear what did it sound like to them, what did they relate to, and they related to the whole thing. It was really quite amazing. And then another big time of thinking about my encounter with Celebrate Life, again at the Sunday School Board, was when the 1991 Baptist hymnal, so I'm skipping decades, 72, I hear about it. In the early 80s, I'm conducting it with the big youth choir. Now in the early 90s, 1991, the 1991 Baptist hymnal releases that included In Remembrance and for thine is the kingdom. Buryl Red, the composer, was conducting the orchestra for that week. We were meeting in Nashville to unveil the 1991 hymnal, and we had the Opry House, the new Opry House, but we had 8,000 people sign up that wanted to come, and it would only hold 4,000. So we had to do everything each night twice, and there were 3 or 4 nights. On the night that Buryl conducted, let's see, trying to think, we only did the one thing from Celebrate Life, and that is He is Alive. Well, Burl's conducting He is Alive with Nashville Symphony behind him and 4,000 people in front of him twice. And they're singing, He is alive, He is alive, He is alive, plus Christ the Lord is risen today, and the Amens from memory precisely. Of course, there's 4,000 ministers in music largely, and they'd all conducted it or sung in it. And it just blew him away that they knew it so well from memory that long afterwards. And so those, I remember some moments more than I remember my first, sure enough, encounter with it. And here's another moment, sitting here talking to you about Celebrate Life. It speaks to its timelessness, I think, which is a word you can't use very often on anything. Because timelessness means that it is always timely. There's not very much that's true. And I think it's true of Celebrate Life because the gospel is timeless. And it is so obviously a presentation of the gospel. So I'll think about that for a long time. When was the first time I really encountered it? It couldn't have been before 72, but I don't know.
I've seen a video of that 1991 praise sing, and I remember Buryl Red conducting that, a video of it, and it looked like he was about to take flight.
He was.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to levitate because in the first time, like I said, we had 8,000 people, so we had to do 4,000, and there was just time enough to get people out of the building and back into the building. So we were in the green room. There was an Opry House, and this Dr. Wes Forbes and myself and Buryl would come in and out. And after that first time, the first presentation, Buryl was he didn't know whether to laugh or cry, to say anything, to say nothing, to just blabber. He was so blown away that they knew it that well. So he was a little more prepared for it than the second go-around was ready. But yes, it was a magnificent, humbling experience for him. And I think he already knew, but this underscored that it was much bigger than him. It was much bigger than him and Ragan together. And he didn't know that. And that night, it didn't belong to him and Ragan anymore. He saw that it belonged to the ministers of music and to the churches. And it was theirs. And they were letting him wave his arms, but they could have sung it. All he would have to do was say go and sit down and just listen. It was quite a moment. I'm glad it's on YouTube. I'll have to look it up.
I'm not sure if it's on YouTube.
Okay.
I actually remember watching it as a student here, actually.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if it was for a class or what, but anyways, yeah.
It was quite a moment.
Yeah.
Well, I was in the audience that night.
Oh, were you?
Yeah. So I was at praise sing, but I wasn't obviously on platform, but remember it well. To loop back to the first time I conducted this work, conducted as a very generous word for me at the time, but the first time I ever conducted it, very different, but it demonstrates the impact that this work had. It was at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Alabama when I was a sophomore in college, and I had put together quite a good youth choir, and we had done another Buryl Red, Ragan Courtney musical called Bright New Wings in the summer of 1979, and taken it on a little tour. And so I had to have something more challenging the next year, so I thought, well, Celebrate Life's quite a lot more challenging. So I thought, well, we'll learn this musical. So we did, and we staged it and took it on tour and all of that. But what that says to me, looking back, is that this musical had drilled all the way down into the very smallest little churches in the Deep South. It wasn't just making the big screen. Another interesting thing about that, just anecdotally, we didn't have a guitar player in our church. And if you remember, we had to use the track at the time. But the the little music in the middle and they went wandering from town to town and city to city. There's no accompaniment for that on the track.
Right.
So we had no guitar players, so I came up with the idea that we would use an auto harp. That's all that we had. So we had a person in the group play the auto harp. There's also that organ piece in there, that's not on the track. And I took it to my college choral director, and he went in one of our halls on campus and recorded the organ part, so we would have it in our track. So just all of these ways to get it done. But that was the summer of 1980 that I first interacted with this work in terms of teaching it.
That is a good point about Celebrate Life, that it is accessible to the biggest of big churches and the smallest of small churches, and still can be done in a way that's powerful and be done well, and it tells you how well it's written.
And it could be done. It could be done in the traditional choir loft with robes, and it seemed appropriate, or it could be done out here with props, and it would seem appropriate. It was so flexible and portable. So however out there and edgy you thought your church was, you could do that. However much you were afraid of that and wanted to keep it within the choir loft, you could do that, and it didn't suffer either way, which was quite remarkable.
I also fondly remember Easter Sunday of that very year of the youth choir starting our Easter Sunday, our sunrise service with "He is alive, He is alive," and running all out through the congregation and all of those things that were so 70-ish. And that's right. So much excitement.
So fresh.
So fresh. Yeah.
So it's a little bit hard for somebody like me. I was born in 1989. It's hard for somebody like me to imagine what the church culture was in the 1960s and early 1970s. You've already said your church was only reading out of the King James Bible, and and that's hard for me to understand because I was born after after that kind of era. So can both of you describe what the church culture was in that time period when it was released, but also what the church music of the Baptist church was like? What kind of world did Celebrate Life enter into?
I'll just make one comment, because I don't have a lot to add to that question, because I was so sheltered in that time period. I was kind of in a time capsule where not much happened in our little congregation. But an example, when I was, 15, we formed there was a woman who moved to our community, formed a little youth choir in our church for a small period of time. So we had this, we thought, brilliant idea that we would syncopate "Brethren, we have met to worship," and we would sing, "Brethren, we have met to worship and adore the..." And so we did this just little unison thing with "Brethren, we've met to worship." And we met that with great consternation from some of the people in our church, that we had messed up the hymn, and how could we dare make something sound so secular and worldly and take the hymns into such a dark spot, So today we would think absolutely nothing of 100 times innovation from there. And yet at that time, about 75, that was just so new and different. So churches were just very hymnal bound, anthem bound, tradition bound. When we started to get some little song books from Word and things like that, that was just incredibly opening up to just hear fresher sounds. From Sing and Celebrate, some of those kinds of things especially.
Yeah, in my experience, it's of course very similar to Randall's, and the reason for that is because it was lockstep. I mean, if you were a Southern Baptist church, however small, however big, including this one, which was full of people from Word music, you sang what came out of Nashville. They were periodicals for easy for youth, a little harder for youth, very easy for adults, a little harder still for adults, plus the anthem literature that came out away from those periodicals. At that point, the newest thing we had for hymns was the 1956 hymnal. The 75 wasn't out yet. So there were some churches sticking to the 1940 Broadman, some churches that were brave enough to try the 56 hymnal, but always hymnal. My family was moving around. When I was growing up, my father was in the Marine Corps, and we could move from North Carolina to California and know, if we found a little Southern Baptist church, we know what hymnal was going to be there. It was either going to be the green one or the blue one, 40 or 56, and we knew probably what songs they were going to sing. It was just like being home. Mm-hmm. And so there was this sense of uniformity, but it was to be a little more generous, this huge family called the Southern Baptist Convention, and to be not quite so generous, this bubble, this world called the Southern Baptist world. And there were people trying to get in. In fact, this church is quite amazing in that history, a Southern Baptist church, but there were, in that choir loft, people working for Word Music that were publishing, as Randall said, publishing little books and things that was challenging what was coming out of Nashville for Southern Baptists. So Celebrate Life comes into that environment, which included also a 1968 release of Good News, which was very Peter, Paul, and Mary kind of folky. Having heard that, the Word people decided we need to do something for youth, and they did Tell It Like It Is in 1969, which could only have come from a commercial company, even though the commercial company had largely Southern Baptists under its roof. It was a commercial company, so they could do that. Well, so the 1972, you've got churches that, okay, we'll do the Peter, Paul, and Mary thing. We'll do Good News, although it has a guitar. How about if we do it in the fellowship hall? Yeah. And fellowship hall instead of up here on the platform. But then the edgy churches, edgy churches were starting to do Tell It Like It Is, not just in the huge regional youth choirs, which they used to have. Billy Ray Hearn helped put those together. But the larger churches could maybe venture into it. But it was still edgy. It was still Tell It Like It Is was very Broadway-oriented in its choreography and what the music suggested. The other was very Peter, Paul, and Mary, which was anti-war. So what do you want to do, an anti-war musical or a Broadway musical? Well, a lot of churches say we don't want to do either of those. We dare not. Plop down into that comes comes Celebrate Life with, like we already said, it can be done in the choir loft if that's what you need to get it done. Or it can be done here on the platform, or it can be done in the fellowship hall, and each of those is a different gradation of edginess. So that's kind of part of it.
But I would say that Celebrate Life was the classier, more upscale. It had a little bit of a posture. It wasn't the oratorio of that genre, but it had, it was a dressier kind of posture.
Yeah.
It even looked the cover looked that, and all. And so it was the higher level. If you've done all these other things, then you could move into Celebrate Life.
And I would say, building on what Randall just said, that in a very real sense, Celebrate Life, in my opinion, redeemed the youth musical for the Southern Baptists. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to do Peter, Paul, and Mary because that was anti-war. They didn't want to necessarily do, but they did want to do it. They just couldn't tell anybody, Tell It Like It Is, because that was too Broadway-ish, too dancey. And here comes Celebrate Life, and it redeems the whole genre. Oh, we can participate in youth musical now and not be either one of those anti-things. We can be pro-gospel with this, and it redeemed the whole thing.
It was a bridge between the church, the adult choir cantata, and the youth musical.
Yes, it was.
That's probably where I would say, because every church, even my home church, they always say, if they were seeing me at Christmas, what cantata did you all do this year? Yeah. They're imagining that still doing something from one book, but it was a bridge between John W. Peterson and the youth musical somehow in there. It was a bridge. Another interesting thing to me, though, is in that 60s, 70s time, you had the rural church and the county seat church. And in the county seat, kind of bigger town churches, most of them, the ones in our county, I was a kid, but I grew up knowing these people. There were dozens of kids in youth choirs, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 kids in a youth choir in the small town of 4,000. And so then they were doing these musicals, and it was just a thriving kind of environment. And yet, in our little church, we were still doing what we had done. But there were also things that kept us all together as terms of Baptist, and it was the hymnal, and it was the cooperative program, as I think about it. Yeah. It was that we all gave to missions, and we were adamant about that connection that we had.
Yeah, I mean,
and we also had M Night, right?
Right, yeah. The hymnal was so much the environment that the county seat churches sang the first 60 hymns. The little rural churches sang from about 250 up to 300, something like that, in the page numbers, in hymn numbers. So even then, there was there was the Sunday morning part of the hymnal, and there was the Sunday night part of the hymnal, but the hymnal was the environment. So to get something that was neither big church, little church, Sunday morning, Sunday night, came from the outside in. Said, whoa, who left the door open? And there was a lot of skepticism at first, even with Celebrate Life, because of We Are Three Kings. Yeah. And
scandalous.
Yes, there were a lot of churches that did Celebrate Life except for Three Kings. They would take Three Kings out, and didn't feel better about it. But even then, here's the Hammond organ at places as well as the pipe organ. There's the boom tum boom tum boom tum boom, the drums in that, and they're not sure, and guitars all over the place. But
and the nightclubbishness of I quietly turn to you.
Yes, that's exactly right. And
almost
especially
prostitution-ish and all that. Yeah.
But there was enough in there that they could allow, the church officials could allow it to be done little by little by little. And each of those little steps turned out to be huge.
Yeah. Those are some great thoughts. And we talked briefly there about the term youth musical, which that is probably the best way to define this genre, if you will. And you mentioned Good News and Tell It Like It Is. I failed to mention at the beginning, we're actually in the sanctuary at 7th and James Baptist Church, which is across the street from the campus of Baylor University. And one of the reasons why we chose to film here on the platform is because Kurt Kaiser, who wrote Tell It Like It Is, was a choir member here for many years before he helped plant another church here in town. Kind of if we were to look around, it's almost like if these walls could talk sort of situation. I've heard stories that are probably, maybe even some legendary at some point about how even in this room on Sunday nights, Kurt Kaiser would lead a Sunday night service that was really the cutting edge of what was being written in contemporary Christian music at the time in those decades. And so that's one of the reasons why we chose this location.
Not just Kurt, but for instance, Charlie Brown was a part of this church, and other names that I could say that became names later. They were either in the youth group here or they associated somewhere. Yeah, this is a historic
church. Who also wrote
church.
musicals and
they wrote
lots
musicals.
of good things.
Good ones.
Yeah,
too.
some really good stuff.
Yeah.
So why do you think, we have talked about Good News and Tell It Like It Is. Those two, I think it's safe to say at this point, did not necessarily last the test of time. But
Bits and pieces, from Good News, we have Do You Really Care?
Okay.
From Tell It Like It Is, Pass It On.
Sure.
That kind of thing. But I'm talking about one piece out of each one of those, not the whole thing being sung by memory by 50-year-old people. Yeah. There's a huge difference there. Yeah. And I say that with all deep respect for the folks who wrote those other two, and indeed deep respect. Groundbreaking, and groundbreaking with Good News, and then look what we can do with Tell It Like It Is, and Celebrate Life, I think, finds in the center a crowning place. That, it's groundbreaking, here's what you can do, but this brings it back into the church. In fact, I'll say this, Kurt Kaiser, as you mentioned, a member here, and one of the two writers, he with Ralph Carmichael of Tell It Like It Is, didn't want Tell It Like It Is to be done in this room.
Interesting.
He did not want it to be done. It could be done across the street. It could be done in a big auditorium with a bunch of choirs come from across town. He did not want it done here.
Wow.
I have a recording of him saying that. And that tells you the tug and the pull and the currents and cross currents that was the environment.
It's impossible for someone who didn't grow up in that sort of idea of different definition of reverence, of what could be done in the sanctuary space. Right. It's impossible to communicate that. Right. And how you didn't do a speaker that was funny or something in a sanctuary. You just wouldn't think of that, or even a recital that had, some pop song in it or something like that. You just wouldn't put that in the church. You couldn't risk that at the time.
You talked about that genre of youth musicals, and that is the right word for it. And I join thousands of others who think Celebrate Life was the pinnacle of that. It produced a lot of good youth musicals and a lot of poor ones. But I think was acknowledged directly or indirectly, officially or unofficially, as Celebrate Life was the peak. There were some good ones on the way up and some good ones on the way down, but it was at the peak. I don't think anyone would push back on that.
Because also, it was like the cantata idea that you have to have a fresh one every year. So right. Once you've done one, you have to keep on. So, there was, I don't know them as well as Dr. York, but Light Shine, I mentioned already, there was one about Lottie Moon, Lottie D or something.
Lottie D?
Yeah, that was a both.
Bright New Wings.
Bright New Wings was and those three were all written by Buryl and Ragan. So there were a lot of them and good ones, but the staying power, Dr. York mentioned what is staying from those early ones, and I guess really the only song that has stayed across the time is In Remembrance, that is still in hymnals and things.
In Remembrance is in a lot of hymnals.
In a lot of hymnals. That's the only one that's made the broader.
For Thine is the Kingdom has had a bit of a life as sort of a prayer response or a benediction or something like that. But even though they didn't get baptized by the hymnal, there were still some other songs that stayed as solos, of course, from some Cynthia's.
But the unit of Celebrate Life hung together.
It hung together, still.
So for an example, I posted about this a few weeks ago and learned that there were 3 other churches in the state of Texas that were also doing a 50th anniversary concert of it this year. And that's unique to Celebrate Life.
Yeah.
I don't know of another youth musical that somebody's doing a 50th
None
anniversary.
other than I know.
I've never heard of another one being celebrated.
Yeah.
So I've done one for a reunion.
Why was that?
Think about that.
Why is that?
That happens with Celebrate Life. It happens with Messiah.
Yeah. I think the broadness of the message of Celebrate Life might be a big part of it. I think it is the music, it's the text, but I think it tells the full story. Some of the other musicals were more issue-oriented, or they would take a slice of the gospel.
Or they would use the slang. There's a difference between the language of the newspaper and slang. Celebrate Life has the language of the newspaper. Some of the others, on purpose, would use slang to show that they were up and they were cool, and it worked. It connected with young people, but it didn't have lasting power. So you take the gospel, and instead of 3 guys sitting here like we are, there were 4, and they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're telling the story as they lived it. It brought it up to date, alive amongst us. It's hard to beat the gospel for the storyline and scripture passage as the lyrics. That is indeed timeless. And I really consider it to be a combination, and this isn't some big crystal ball thing, but of divine inspiration and human genius combined. The human genius I would put into Buryl, even with Ragan, though he won't allow that, and certainly into Cynthia's singing. You take this skill set genius of best that humans have to offer, and the divine inspiration, and then you put that into a turmoil kind of church setting, and it came and it keeps on coming. 50 years is a testimony enough to what it was and what it did for that genre. But I tell you, I think it also did this, and you may or may not agree with this, but it grew up a generation of teenagers who became the adults who were running the church and said, by the way, we want that on Sunday morning out of our hymnals, and if the hymnal can't handle it, put it on a screen. Now, I've said that kind of thing in front of Kurt Kaiser before, and he would get red in the face. He did not want to be connected with it in any way. But on the positive side of that, there's for every one of these slang musicals, and I'm not saying that Tell It Like It Is was, but for every one of those slang musicals, there's the current language of the newspaper musical that stayed afloat and finally only. But it I think brought us a generation that wanted to sing that kind of music even when their hair started turning gray.
I think also that the Celebrate Life did not have the shock value, except for We Three Kings.
Yeah.
And the other musicals, some of the early ones, had a bit more of a shock value. And I remember, this is also in the Godspell time.
Sure.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
Just
And
a few years prior.
Exactly. And I remember knowing about Godspell, and the first time I heard it, it was almost like this might corrupt you. You know, you go to this Godspell performance at the community college, but, you know, don't really believe it all because, you know, they crucified Jesus on a fence, and that's so sacrilegious, and, you know, all these ideas. And so, you know, we were warned kind of as the youth group, you know, be careful about this. Yeah. But Celebrate Life didn't have that shock.
That's right.
Thing. And if you thought that the Three Kings, if that were the shock thing, then you just simply left it out. And I think it was probably left out as much or more than it was included.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah.
I think more actually than it was included, probably. Because I was told the first time I did it, don't do that. We did it anyway. But that's what I was told.
Yeah. Well, I had to think about doing this year, did I want to do We Three Kings or not? And chose that I wanted to do it for our church because it's the 50th and, you know, we should do it cover to cover and all of that. And that made me think about something I heard you, Dr. York, say 10 years ago at a 40th anniversary concert of this at another church. And you had talked about that We Three Kings scene and the controversy of it, but you also framed it in a pretty deep theological way that gave a really powerful perspective to what that scene can demonstrate. So would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, and in fact, I actually brought with me a manuscript from that. It's a short little thing, and I might read it rather than try to remember it. But it was as you said, introduce the 40th anniversary.
I should mention, or he will get mad, it was at my brother's church.
It's your brother's
10 years
church,
ago.
Columbus Avenue.
That's Columbus Avenue here in Waco.
And it's 2.5 pages. I'll just read the portion that relates to We Are Three Kings. And I said this: to hear this musical is to be reminded that controversy in church music is not a new phenomenon. One of the songs that we will hear this afternoon is We Are Three Kings. This song has often been categorized as the comic relief section of Celebrate Life. I disagree. Over the decades, many ministers of music have sadly decided to eliminate We Are Three Kings from their sophisticated performances. To do so is to reveal a sad misunderstanding of the message of the song. We Are Three Kings speaks its particular gospel message to every generation, certainly no less to ours. This song speaks not of comedy, but of silliness. Very serious silliness. I don't know if Ragan and Buryl knew it when they wrote it, but the Holy Spirit knew it when he inspired it. This is indeed serious silliness. You kings of the governments of this earth and all political parties, your visions of personal grandeur and importance look silly beside the glory of the King of Kings. Kings of finance and commerce, your riches look silly when confronted by the teachings of the King of Kings who owns it all. Kings of technology and entertainment, you kings of this world, your claims and promises and feelings of entertainment are silly in comparison to the truth, the glory, the majesty, and power of King Jesus. We Are Three Kings might make us laugh, but it should make us weep. The song speaks of silliness exposed in the pomp and circumstance, in the boasting and strutting of all earthly kings.
Wow.
I read that, and Ragan was sitting on the front pew, and I saw his face turn from smile to very serious, almost weep, and then laughing. I went and I sat down beside him, and he whispered to me, "I didn't know all that," but you know, and I'm sure he didn't. But that's how art works.
Exactly.
Art speaks to the artist, and art speaks beyond the artist. And as brilliant as Ragan is, art is often smarter than the artist. And so no wonder he didn't see it. He was too close to it. But to me, that's why it should be included.
And how many times in life do we laugh rather than cry? Because laughing is way more acceptable.
Yeah. So the Three Kings, and it was meant to be silly. There was no other way that Buryl could set it than he did. This twirly, oily. He's talking about the beards and all this stuff. It had to be, but I do think it was a serious silliness that we need to embrace and not avoid.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So memorable that 10 years later I remembered to ask you to share that again. So yeah, thank you for sharing. So to shift gears a little bit, can you give us an idea? We talked about the church culture that Celebrate Life entered into. Could you give us an idea of what popular music was like in the 1960s and early 70s, which again, to somebody of my generation, we know the recordings and we know the groups, but what, and perhaps even just the culture in general of the 60s, because I actually think there's a lot of parallels between what we have experienced perhaps over the last several years and the world that Celebrate Life entered into. So,
if I can say
please.
In the 60s, I was in junior high school, Marine Corps, and college. Starting in college, everything that was in any way established, capital E or lowercase e, everything that was established was seen as suspect and that something that probably should be dissolved or turned upside down. Everything. I mean, draft cards and how you dress and what does it mean to, why be married, and on, and what's patriotism, on and on and on. Everything was turned upside down. Oh, yeah, everything. Hair went long, and it just, I could go on and on and on, but that's not why we're here. Always only to say everything was in turmoil, turned upside down. Patriotism now was something that was looked down on, and how to address people. And just the language and what was acceptable in language, what was acceptable on TV. You know, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz slept in separate beds, and they were married on TV and are married in real life. And then that goes to anything goes on screen. So that was part. Now the music of the culture was a soundtrack to that. And Randall's already mentioned part of it. We had going on out there. On the Broadway platform, Godspell,
Superstar,
Jesus Christ Superstar, Joseph and the multicolored coat thing, whatever that was. And even that wasn't as new as it thought it was. If you go across the pond to England in 1950s, you get Jeffrey, what was his name? It starts with a B. But anyway, he did Jazz Mass. He did Jazz Mass over there, which was kind of led into
Beaumont.
Yeah, Jeffrey Beaumont. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's what was going on. And then in popular music, again, it was just a soundtrack for all that mess. There was a song to go with any part of the mess that you wanted to look at.
It was also diverse. You have everything from hard rock to the Carpenters, and, and you have the close to you feel, and then you have all these other, against authority kind of stuff, the anti-authority.
But, Ralph Carmichael, who's part of Tell It Like It Is, writes a song called Love is Surrender to His Will. It's performed like this. It turns out to be a way they changed one word in that and sold diamond rings to people getting married, to young couples getting married. He made a pretty good chunk of money off of that being a song that sold diamond rings, at least on the West Coast. So here's something that happens in the church, love is surrender. It's going out into the world, and the world stuff is coming into the church through the Jesus movement, which was huge, and all this kind of stuff. It's going back and forth. And the gatekeepers don't know which way to let the doors swing.
Well, and then you have the intentional stuff like singing, little example would be singing Amazing Grace to the tune of the
House of the Rising Sun.
Sun.
Yeah.
And singing Amazing Grace to the da-dum-bum-bum, the world to sing.
Yeah, like to buy a world of Coke.
Like to buy the world of Coke, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, meter all matches up. All these things where you're bringing, it's like so cool to match up anything and bring it all together.
And there was a legitimate attempt there to put the gospel into that.
Yeah,
all the
that's
way
right.
from the Tell It Like It Is to the Celebrate Life. Both of those were legitimate works done by the people sitting in the same choir loft, literally, in this building. And so it was really a strange time, and all we knew to hang on to, we had to get down to the core of what is church about. Jesus is Lord. We had to get down into that and say, okay, now that we've started there, let's build this thing back up again.
It was an expansion of definition of God, in a sense, that was happening all around us, that God is here, God is here, God is here,
And
God is
culture
here.
is saying God is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet the church was saying, but the church had to respond, in a sense, and so the church, the big church, all that comprised the church, the messages were coming from all different kinds of places.
So here comes Celebrate Life with its Hammond organ and its big organ pipes. Here it comes with boom-cha, 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 boom-cha. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John telling you the gospel as they lived it and saw it. And so I think Celebrate Life helped us get back to the core and brought with it some of the more acceptable musical trappings, and then goes back out again giving permission.
Well, even some choral aspects that were new, like the He is alive, He is alive. The whole speaking thing was very new in choral music.
That's right.
And that, I remember, like the let the redeemed of the Lord say so.
Say so, say so, say so, say so.
Yeah, that's a great anthem, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, all kinds of things like that. That was Eugene Butler.
Yeah.
But a great piece, but that was all coming even from some classical kinds of things, and it's basically recitative-ish.
And
it goes back to the Passion.
Gave permission, like, "Oh, thou to whose all-searching sight." This was just an anthem; it wasn't any part of the musical. But now you could write anthems like that, send it to Nashville, and have some hope that it was going to get published, because now the climate is changing and the environment is changing too rapidly for many people. But it changed. And then comes the 75 hymnal. Interestingly enough, the 75 hymnal did not reflect Celebrate Life. I think Pass It On is in there.
It is.
Tell It Like It Is. But that's it. In Remembrance is not in 75. It didn't show up until 91, which is a surprising thing to me.
Because there are other things in there.
Yes.
Yeah, that are syncopated and represent the time. Yeah.
So to go along that track about the musical elements in Celebrate Life, as I listen to it, I have thought, there's a melody, for instance, "You're the wind I soar on, da da ya da da da." To me, that sounds like the Carpenters,
Yes, it does.
or
That's my
right,
that's-
and then there's a bass line like da 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 da, which could be the Beatles, or could be something else, or even chord progressions
That's right.
that were completely different for that time. Nowadays, are just normal.
Well, that's one reason why that updated soundtrack to Celebrate Life was at the 25th anniversary or something, where they did an updated soundtrack. I didn't think personally that the updated soundtrack did anything really, because the chord progressions and a lot of other things were so 70s that you couldn't get past that, no matter how you sort of package it, what frame you put around it.
There were two attempts at upgrading. One is that, and Clint has his hand right there, and that was 89?
89.
89. We decided at the Sunday school board, we got this great idea. It's time to freshen up. We'll get Buryl in so everybody know it's legit, and we'll do a new Celebrate Life. And it flopped. I'm not saying that it was bad. What I'm saying is the diehards, the ones who wanted to do Celebrate Life because they remembered it, would not hear of even Buryl doing an update. So that
By
copy,
then, they were their parents.
Yes. So the update went down in flames as far as sales was concerned. But even the fact that we tried to update it sent the ministers of music back to their libraries, their choral libraries. They dusted off and they did the original Celebrate Life again, almost to shake their fist in our face in Nashville. But then Bruce Greer did an orchestral updating, I think, that had learned from the '89 incident. And it's not saying the '89 one, it was bad, but the recording, it wasn't Cynthia doing the solos. And we found out very quickly those are Cynthia's songs. Mm-hmm. They are Cynthia's. Now, Mary Jane, somebody can come and stand behind the pulpit right here and sing it because she knows she's not Cynthia. But somebody who did recording, who do you think you are? Cynthia Clawson? You're not. Mm-hmm. And it was really amazing how the churches started to defend the original work. Mm-hmm. And they would allow some refining, but not a total rebuild. And that's one of the moments when we knew, okay, this thing is bigger than us, and it's even bigger than we thought. And by bigger, I mean more important, more groundbreaking, and it's an Ebenezer. Hither by thy help we've come. We built, with the Celebrate Life, Southern Baptist Church music raised in Ebenezer. And they didn't want anybody messing with the rocks.
It's interesting that the people that would have sung this as teenagers in when it was brand new, or people from mid-60s to early 70s now, which is people older than I a bit. But it's just sobering to imagine that.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, those are the folks who are singing, some of the folks in our choir singing it, that have come up to me and said, we still remember every word from when we were teenagers, and it's already memorized. And that tells you how how big, for lack of a better word.
It was indeed iconic, as Randall put into the conversation, the language, the freshness of the language, and the acceptance of the music, and the flexibility of the music. Why wouldn't you remember that? And that opened all the doors and the windows in buildings like this. Of course you would remember that. And it would be a key moment in your spiritual development.
Yeah. But it also has a very 70s touch.
It does.
I remember my bedroom and how it was decorated, in junior high and early high school, and it was all of this, the wind I soar on, the grass I run through, all of that sort of nature-y, pastel-ish, black light, reflective paint, the posters I had in my room as a college student, it was this nature-y kind of feel. And so the language is very much in its time, as it is owing to the language, to the dialect, in a sense, of its time.
Yeah.
It's also a model of, if you look at the structure, and we've already sort of talked about it, but the first thing in it is a prelude that really is a pipe organ prelude. It could be done on the synthesizer.
It's my favorite part of the whole musical, is the prelude.
Yeah.
And I've heard the prelude used a number of times away from the musical, like just by an organist.
Right.
Which is really...
It became part of the organ lit.
Yeah. And then the postlude also...
The postlude.
Kind of an echo of it.
Yeah, and it's even now... In my own congregation, for instance, if I'm going to do something that I think will stretch the congregation and will be something different that maybe we've never done it that way before, it's a different sound, I'll bookend it with what they are used to. And that's kind of how this whole thing is structured, where the bookends are organ, music, and then in the middle, it's this whole other thing, But then also...
Start the journey and bring them home when you're done, and everybody's okay as long as you get them home at the end of the trip.
Yeah.
And then sprinkled in, though, is, right after the big bass line of He is Alive, then out of nowhere, it's, organ at full throttle again, for Christ the Lord is risen today. And
that's one of my favorite moments.
A recitative-like portion in, oh goodness, I'll look, just so I don't misquote it. Hail, O Blessed One. So it's very recitative-like, and then out of nowhere, a huge drum set solo,
And the clapping also, because there's a day when we didn't clap in church.
That's
so,
right.
Hail, O Blessed One. That's groundbreaking. So you can't imagine the shock value of clapping in church.
Yeah, that's right.
We didn't used to clap after, anything. I don't care what you said in church. You didn't clap over baptism. Oh my gosh, how could you desecrate baptism by clapping? Wouldn't that be awful? It didn't matter.
Times have changed.
Yes.
They
have.
Continue to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know both of you either knew really well or had interaction with both Buryl Red and Ragan Courtney. I wanted you all to just speak to who, in Buryl Red's case, who he was, and in Ragan Courtney's case, who he is, and some friendships there that you have enjoyed. And so why don't we start with Buryl Red, who was the composer for Celebrate Life, and just speak a bit about his career, and how you knew him.
Well, let me say that Dr. York is far, far, far better friends. These are people that I knew, I met, but have no dear friendship in the way that Dr. York does.
Sure. Yeah.
I defer.
Just to say Burl's name, just to say his name brings all kinds of these fresh memories, like we're talking about, fresh moments, the memories of them rushing back into my heart and heart. He did his master's degree across the street here at Baylor Music. And he did some work with Word while he was here before he started doing his own thing. He was the writer of some anthems, and he was mostly an arranger of some hymns. That's how we knew him. And then comes Celebrate Life. And I don't know who hooked Ragan and Buryl together. I should know, but I don't know. Ragan can tell you who got them connected. But I think Buryl was inspired by Ragan's words. I know he was. And he was inspired by the environment that we've just talked about. He lived in New York City. He was a music editor for Silver Burdett, I think it was, who did music for schools.
A whole series of textbooks. The Silver Burdett series used to be the textbook series used by elementary music teachers.
And then the Baptist Sunday School, or Southern Baptist, started a thing called the Radio and Television Commission. It was not part of the Sunday School Board. It was a separate thing. It was housed in Fort Worth. Excuse me. And they started a men's choir called the Centurymen. Woodward, Jim Woodward was the first conductor, but I don't know all the inside thing, but that lasted only about a year. Then they asked Buryl to come in. Buryl not only conducted them, but he wrote for them extensively, almost exclusively. And so the Centurymen, this was 100 ministers of music from all across Southern Baptist Convention, and they could sing Heaven Down. And so Buryl was known as this arranger who now has this magnificent choir. And our music in here, you see how big that choir loft is? The choir was how music happened. The choir came from the congregation. They sang arrangements of what the congregation was already singing, and then with that permission, they did new things. And Buryl was right in the middle of that. He's doing arrangements, he's doing new anthems, and he's conducting a choir of choir directors. And then comes the 75 hymnal, and the celebration of it in Nashville, Praise Sing. And he had the Centurymen there, and I can't even explain. It was like Ridge, Crescent, Gloria, and the Music Week on steroids. So he became the minister of music's minister of music. He became the composer's composer, the arranger's arranger. And, but with Celebrate Life, that said, oh yeah, that Buryl Red, didn't I do an anthem of his? Didn't I do an arrangement of his? Yeah. And now he's the one that's conducting Centurymen, and he's doing Celebrate Life. And he did Celebrate Life, and suddenly he just burst upon the scene. He was very quiet, very unassuming, very back-offish kind of thing. Even when he's conducting, he wasn't wild. But his work was stellar. And now he was tough to work with. I was around when he did a couple of recordings in Nashville, and he'd wait till the very last second and then just work around the clock, for like 36 hours straight. You'd have 3 days, and he'd use the last one day of that to get the work done, and he would just work without sleeping, without eating. He had that kind of focus. But a remarkable churchman, a remarkable, he could be at home literally on Broadway in New York, and he was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a little unassuming house, went to a little unassuming church. So he knew the whole gamut. He was quite a remarkable.
And we do have his archives here at Baylor. We have all of his papers and,
I didn't know that.
and all of that. He also had some anthems that were significant, in addition to the work with the Centurymen. I've always thought his arrangement of America the Beautiful was the most. It's nice that he had a very scaled down, subtle arrangement and not bombastic or anything like that. Always thought still think his arrangement of At the Cross, nobody has done better than that. I still love that arrangement. And those are two of the ones that just stick out. And
Why Do I Sing About Jesus? Arrangement of that has a moment. Yeah, the Centurymen singing at the 1975 Baptist hymnal unveiling. And they did this, Why Do I Sing About Jesus? And it ends in this huge, about 8-part, T, 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 B, 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 B thing. And somebody from the balcony, there were probably 5,000 or 6,000 people there, and hollers down from the balcony, sing it again. And you can hear that on the LP, that hollering and sing it again. And Buryl looks like that and sang it again. And he became the darling of that. I mean, that, plus 2 or 3 years earlier to Celebrate Life, he became quite a, like I said earlier, the minister of music's minister of music.
Wow. Yeah. He passed away in 2013, and I was reading, to prepare for this, reading his obituary and reading biographies that people had written about him. Yale, where he got his, one of his degrees, wrote something, and talked about his writing for church music, but also the fact that his music was heard on Saturday Night Live, and his orchestrations were on Broadway. And there's very few people, I think, that straddled so many different elements of the music industry.
Especially with such humility and such grace.
And he did all those recordings. He was the producer for all the recordings of the Silver Burdette series, which was a K through 6th grade curriculum.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then Ragan Courtney, who wrote the book and the lyrics in Celebrate Life, I know we want to just reflect on his life and career as well.
Poet, playwright, actor, pastor, free spirit, dear friend.
I think if Southern Baptists have a poet, it would be somewhere between a toss-up between Dr. York and and Ragan, because I think those are the people's poets. The voices that spoke more eloquently than the rest of us, the voices that we all wanted to hear. And they rang with familiarity. Perhaps Ragan's more so if you actually knew that he was the voice of the recording of Celebrate Live, because not only we didn't mention that the recording was quite well appreciated.
He was John
on the recording, and so you know that sound, and the first time you ever hear Ragan speak, you think, oh my gosh, I know that voice.
I know that.
So I think, somewhere in there are, some of the greatest text and the most familiar and the most impactful of Southern Baptists would be with these two men.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ragan. Ragan and Terry York in the same sentence. Thank you.
Well, it's true, Terry.
Well, thank you. Ragan, I think, was also, if Buryl was the minister of music's minister of music, Ragan was the edgy minister's edgy minister. He would go out to the edge for us. He could go out and do a play. He could go out and write a play, write a poem, write a lyric that's out on the edge. And so that's just Ragan. Now, I know that firsthand. When I was had a position that I had in the Sunday school board for a while, I hired him to work for me for a while. And my boss said, what's he going to do? And I said, I don't know. Well, we're going to keep track of everything he does. I'm going to make a file called Ragan Courtney, and we're going to put everything he writes and does and says in that file. And I don't know when he'll come to work. I don't know when he'll go home. But I know that he's going to bring an energy not only to my section, but to our department and to the whole Baptist Sunday School Board. He was that kind of personality. He would go out to the edge. Well, sometimes he would go out to the edge, and you let him know I said this. He would go out there to the edge where the whole Sunday School Board starts to sweat a little bit. You know, well, that was uncomfortable for him. It was uncomfortable for us. And he finally, on his own, he left. And it was a sad time when he left, except for the fact that we still had this bit of puffiness about us. Ragan worked with us. We worked with Ragan Courtney, which means we borrowed a little of his edginess without the risk. And so he went out to the edge for us. And I count him a dear and blessed friend, and the reason I say that is not to brag, but it is to say, if you know Ragan, it feels like you're the only person who knows him. It's that personal. So he goes out to the edge, and my heart goes with him. And he goes out there for us and takes all the risk.
I think that begs the question of do we have those artists who go to the edge, you know, and I call that prophetic.
Yes,
I think there's a
absolutely.
propheticness about it, and I wonder sometimes, do we have a culture, even in a church culture, that allows risk taking? And that's one of my biggest questions, really, of our church today is, do we allow that, and who are those people? And I think we had a number of them in the past.
Yeah. And by risk taking, I don't mean that he writes in curse words. I mean, it's the questions he asks, the issues that he explores.
They say the things that everybody else thinks but are afraid to say.
Yeah, and does so with the Bible in one hand, you know, and a newspaper in the other hand, and he's out there asking these questions and writing about these things. It's not that he's writing curse words and we were afraid to do that. It's the part of society and culture that he takes the gospel to and comes back and reports to us. This is how the gospel looks out there. Here's what it sounds like. That's Ragan Courtney. And you won't have to visit with him long, and you'll pick up on that.
And I think it deserves, I think somewhere we need to say something else about Cynthia.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Because you can't do this without her,
That's right.
because she's the life of this thing. She's the front face. The first time I ever heard, you can't say heard Cynthia, you have to see Cynthia.
Experience, experience.
But I always say the first time I ever saw her almost instead of heard her was at Glorietta, like summer of '84. And I had never seen any, I certainly had heard her voice, you know, on these recordings and some others, but my goodness, to see the interpretation of the passion with which she brought forth the gospel just changed me. You know, I still think that there's nobody that can get as much passion in a note as Cynthia.
Right,
you know,
or a word.
Yeah, a word. Yeah, I just don't know of anybody who can say, you know, to me, Reba McEntire and Cynthia are the two people that can say the most in a word through singing. I don't know how they put that much in, but you can feel it, you know, deep in yourself.
We were speaking before we started, where we turned the cameras on. I was recently watching a video recording of her in 1992 doing Celebrate Life, a 20th anniversary thing. And the three solos, Song of Mary, I Quietly Turn to You, and Carry Him Gently, with every gesture and every way that she sang and every affect, and she's sung like this her whole life, but it just poured from her soul.
Yeah.
And in a way that is truly indescribable. Even though that phrase is used too much to describe.
That's right. That's right.
But it is, and what underscores it is that's how she lives. That's how she goes to the grocery store. That's how she welcomes friends into her family. That's how she raised her kids. That's Cynthia. You see, and I think that authenticity she can do gestures that if anybody else did it,
you look like a clown.
You'd look like a clown. You'd take her off the stage. But it's coming, because everything that comes from Cynthia is authentic.
What it says is, I'm feeling so much that my voice cannot hold it.
Right.
And I have to have an extension of my body. My limbs have to speak.
Cynthia grew up in a family. She has a sister and a brother. Her father was a pastor of a small Baptist church, Brother Tom. They even called him Brother Tom at home. And and former Marine, by the way, and he was a pastor of a little church. So she grew up in a little church, she and her sister learned how to play the piano, so did her brother, so that they could accompany the singing at their dad's church. So she didn't grow up in some grand, she wasn't a backstage Broadway or Hollywood. She grew up in a little tiny Southern Baptist church, learning how to play the piano for that and how to sing for that. People started noticing that she could sing when, in the summers of her going to college, she would be what Southern Baptists called summer missionaries. I don't know if they still do that or not. And she would sing, and suddenly her job that was for the summer was not to go out and do backyard Bibles, it was to sing for as many people as you can. So that's just who she is. It was in her from the very beginning. She knew what little churches were, and that's where her heart was. And in fact, she and Ragan ended up co-pastoring a little church in Austin some years ago now, but they were co-pastors, and not her being the pastor's wife. They were co-pastors.
And she was a student at Howard Payne, so right here in Texas.
Yeah.
But I think if that singing hadn't been so amazing on that album, I don't think this musical would have gone where it went.
Not as far.
I don't think it would have, because a lot of when something launches in a certain way, that has a lot to do with how it sustains. And if you don't launch well, you don't have the staying power typically.
Yeah.
So I think that's very important.
And she would go anywhere. I mean, she would go to the biggest arena and the biggest gathering, and she would go to a little podunk-collar church and sing Sunday night for them. And it was the same full presence with absolutely no difference.
Right.
And that word gets around. You don't even have to have her in your church to know that that's who she is, and that's what she does. And you'll hear that when you interview them, that's still a part of her. And if you call her phone says, hello, she sings her hello on the, just the songs coming out of her all the time. And she's not
the
putting
pitch has
on.
gotten a little lower through the years.
Much lower. And she'll own up to that as well.
Yeah, and just another word there, willing to sing anywhere in the smallest of churches and the biggest of churches, and yet a Dove Award winner and a Grammy Award winner too, and what an incredible artistic witness, in all of that.
Well, and she was on in some of the, those Gaither gatherings.
Oh, yeah.
She was
on Homecoming.
On those homecomings. She was 2 or 3 times. You'll see her on 2 or 3 of those videos. She's singing, and you can tell those are genuine also.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a scripted to what's going to happen when, but the tears are genuine, and you can just see these other singers melting like anyone melts to hear her sing.
So to wrap up with just a couple of questions, I wanted to ask both of you personally, what is your favorite moment in Celebrate Life, and why is it your favorite moment? Whether it be a narration or whether it be a piece, and why it's your favorite?
That's a very difficult question. I anticipated that question, and by the time I'd finished writing out an answer, I'd listed almost everything. So I'm going to boil it down to this. It is the organ prelude. It's my favorite. And I think the reason for that is because I know what's coming after it, and it hints to it. Not so much as the postlude reminds us, but it does hint. But for me, without words, it gives me space to remember everything we've talked about. Ragan, Cynthia, Buryl, what's going on in church, what's going on in the world, what's going on in music. For me, that's there for me to revisit when I hear the organ prelude. That's my favorite part of the whole thing.
Wow. Maybe a couple of things. I think one would be, I love the moment when it goes into Christ the Lord is risen today. I just absolutely love that transition into that hymn. That's one of my favorite moments. But I think I would have to choose I quietly turn to you. And we say, I quietly turned to you when there was nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to go. My body knew all the pain a body could know. I quietly turned to you. But then the loop,
And it comes.
but he turned to me. And I never hear that my heart isn't full and rich and filled with, to me, that little turn embodies grace in as small a turn and yet as big a turn as I've ever remember in a text and in the way that resolves. So I never get weary of hearing that and of thinking of that he turned to me.
Right, yeah. That's, for me, that is one of those, there's certain songs where you remember the first time you heard it. Mm-hmm. And that moment, that turn at the very end, I remember exactly where I was the first time I heard it. And there's just something about it that is just so magnificent. Yeah. And so it's a small moment. It is at the very end of the song, and it's piano, but it's so beautiful.
And it's subtle, and yet it captures all of what, in a sense of what is our faith all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to read that real quick, just as we're talking about it, because it is such a wonderful text. And we've talked about Ragan's writing, and let's see.
Yeah, that's something I have to remember. Cynthia owns that thing so much. I have to remember, Ragan wrote those words. That was Ragan's testimony before it was hers, and now it's ours. But it pivots with her singing of it.
Yeah. There was nowhere else to turn and nowhere else to go. My body knew all the pain a body can know. When I quietly turned to you, I quietly turned to you. Help of the helpless, I turned to you. When no one else would help and no one else would hear, no one else could hear, my cries full of anguish, my cries full of fear, then I quietly turned to you. I quietly turned to you. Hope of the hopeless, I turned to you. I saw you standing there. I saw the beauty from you beaming. I saw the peace, the joy, the perfect love that could be. I saw you standing there. I thought that I was surely dreaming, for suddenly warmth and love and joy were shining through me. As you quietly turned to me, you quietly turned to me. Friend of the friendless, you turned to me. And here's the turn. Now I know such perfect peace. I feel such sweet release. Your love let me live again. Your love set me free. Help of the helpless, friend of the friendless. I quietly turned to you, and you turned to me. And then it repeats, and you turned to me. Mm-hmm. And just an amazing text. In my office over the last few days, reading these narrations and reading these texts, just been so many holy moments because of the turns of phrases and because of the quality of writing in the lyrics, but also the narrations, which are paraphrases of Scripture a lot of the time, but then truly unique ways that Ragan described the crucifixion.
It's a sermon. It's a sermon by an artist, by a poet.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's a sermon by a poet.
Well, and in Buryl's writing of that, and you turn to me, it goes up. He doesn't go, and you turn to me, which would have been fine, but he moves it up. See,
it launches us.
It
doesn't close the world in. It opens it up.
It lifts. Yeah. See, and it says to me, it will happen again and again.
Yeah.
And see, we're talking about one or two measures in the entire book of beautiful things. We're talking about one or two measures. That's art at work. That's a brushstroke. Yeah. That's a brushstroke. And that's how art works. No wonder we keep going back to it. Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier because I think it's so true, and it explains moments like that. It's divine inspiration, and it's human genius. And when that comes together with authenticity of Christ followers, 50 years is nothing. I mean, they may be watching this video, 50 more years from now, saying before we do it again. Look at other things that have lasted that long. And I'm not saying that Buryl Red is Mozart or Handel, but I am saying that the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit, and the inspiration is always now, always now. And this work is one of those always now moments. It is timeless, as you said, I think, at the very beginning.
Yeah. Just one final question, and I would love to hear y'all's personal reflections and thoughts on this, but here we are in 2022, 50 years later, and we've had this whole conversation, but speak to my congregation about what you think God may have for us as we present this in a little over a month, and perhaps what we need to be on the lookout for spiritually, but also just perhaps some ways that you can imagine God may work through this as we prepare, but also as we present.
Well, I think perhaps just the idea that we're having this rather lengthy conversation about something that's this old and is quite significant, and I think it deserves a congregation's attention. Recently, I've had the painful experience of clearing out a couple of church music ministry libraries where they say, we're not going to have a choir anymore, can you help us get rid of this music? And in both of those libraries, there were copies of Celebrate Life. And they weren't in Baptist churches.
Yeah.
But most, you go through tons and tons and tons of music, and most of it, a lot of it, you can say, well, this probably wouldn't be sung again. The chances of it being sung, it's just too dated, it's too this, it's too something. But the fact that this is being sung again says something about its staying power. And I think it says, as Dr. York has so eloquently stated, about the Holy Spirit's role in all this, because it couldn't be anything else. Sentimentality can go a long, long way, but I don't think it goes this far.
Yeah, right.
I don't think it can go this far. And, I would want to almost assign it to that, in some ways, but I don't think it's possible. So there has to be something more. And I do think it's somewhere in the midst of all this. But I think at the end of the day, it's the indescribable. It's the mystery of what God does, and it's the submission of what only God can do, which is beautiful because that takes us out of it. And it's only when we are taken out that, so often we're so big that God really has to work to shine. So I think that's the message for your church is our getting out of the way and letting God shine through this musical, through its history, through its story, through its current rendition and reenactment and what have you.
I would say to your congregation that I'm old enough to say what I'm fixing to say, and that is the current state of the church, the current state of our world, of our nation, reminds me, it's not a duplicate, but it reminds me of the 1960s and early 70s. In the 1960s and early 70s, the world was turned upside down. Government was turned upside down. The church didn't know whether to go out or come back in, go up or go down. Everything was in turmoil. Everything we had known started to crumble or turn upside down, disappear. And out of it comes a musical based straight out on the gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are telling us this, and they're giving Cynthia permission to interpret it. They're giving the choir permission to interpret it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are sitting up here saying, yes, you can sing that. Yes, you can dance that, Three Kings. Yes, you can do that. And out of that turmoil of the 60s and early 70s comes this. We're in a time that feels to this old man very much like, though it's not a carbon copy, very much like the turmoil of the 60s and the early 70s. And I want to say that Celebrate Life is a celebration of hope. Look what came out of this. Something that is ministering to people 50 years later. If we will allow it, out of all the turmoil that we're seeing in our world, in our lives, in our economy, in our church, in our government, all of that turmoil, there's a little thing in the middle of it called the gospel. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John still have something to say to us. Let's listen. Let's listen. And know that they're going to inspire us. Who knows what's going to come out of our current turmoil. But this tells us, Celebrate Life tells us, something good is going to come out because God is in it. Something good is going to come out because this is not bigger than... If we think that the dictators of this world and of its military and of its economies and of its entertainment, if we think those kings have absolutely wiped out the church and all that's good, sing We Are Three Kings. Oh, yeah. I guess that... And then at the end, when he turns to us, as Randall pointed out, the melody line goes up and launches us. In our similar turmoil, there's hope. And Celebrate Life reminds us of that.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time to do this. I know this was a little bit of an odd request for us to come up here and for us to spend 2 hours.
Not so odd coming from you.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. But.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It is a compliment. No one else has asked us to do this.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your words, and we are so grateful for all of that.
It's a privilege.
So we want to just invite you again, April 24th, the Sunday after Easter. We are going to have this celebration of this musical, but just like the title of it says, Celebrate Life. We're celebrating the life of Christ. That day is going to have a different schedule, which we'll talk about in the future, but it also is going to be followed by a big church barbecue out on the grounds, and we hope that you will enjoy all of that together and that you'll invite a friend. So we are looking forward to that day. Thanks for spending your time with us.